Okay, welcome everybody to this rearranged online Zoom Society for the History of Astronomy 2023 Spring Conference. First of all, I would like to thank everybody, including our speakers, who very kindly agreed to revert to an online conference. Unfortunately, circumstances were beyond our control, and as it turned out, the British transport system, particularly the railways, have now gone back to their normality, if you can call it normality. However, it's great to see so many of you with us today. Just a few normal housekeeping. Normally I would direct you to where the toilets and the fire exits are in the building, but if you should know where your toilets and your fire exits are, so I don't need to go into too many details. But we have three very prominent and skilled historians of astronomy and archaeology with us today, and I'm very proud to say that they are three ladies within the society, and we welcome them this afternoon. The presentations will be recorded separately, and we will make sure that they are available via particularly our website after today. They are being recorded. We would ask particularly those of you who are attending to make sure that both your audio and your videos systems are turned off, just to maximize the bandwidth so it doesn't disturb the presentations, and make sure that you have got a specific connection. There is a flexibility in time. I have factored in a bit of a break so that you can refresh your teas and get more biscuits from the biscuit tin, but that will be after Caroline Badwell has finished speaking. After each presentation, there will be time for question and answers, and you can either ask them yourself or you can use the chat facility, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, if I may, and I'm very happy to introduce Miss Megan Briers, who is currently a MPhil student of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge, and has an interest in researching 19th century astronomical field work. Her presentation this afternoon is entitled 19th Century Astronomical Field Work, and if I may, I'd just like to read an introduction that she's passed on to me. Increased mathematical precision in the 19th century meant that solar eclipse exhibitions began regular features in the calendars of astronomers, as the locality of totality could be predicted accurately enough to allow countries to send out parties to investigate properties of the corona. There were women accompanying all the British eclipse parties from 1842 until 1871. But despite the academic attention given to these eclipse exhibitions, the role of women on the exhibitions has often been left as an aside in accounts of scientific aims of the predominantly male astronomers. Questions about the involvement of the women remain as basic as why they precipitated in the exhibitions. This presentation, will discuss the value of women involved with the 1870 eclipse exhibitions. This eclipse was chosen due to the quality of academic material from women involved and the instability of astronomy and eclipse exhibitions structure in 1870. Though assessing the roles of women on exhibitions, an argument is presented about the value given to women as objective observers in this period of astronomy. Women are perceived to have an unbiased mind due to a lack of astronomical knowledge. This precipitation, combined with their social standing, granted them some level of authority within exhibitions, and they were commonly involved with the verification of male astronomers' observations. However, this lack of knowledge and ideas of a limited intellectual capacities meant there was a strict ceiling on their precipitation, and their contributions of original observations was not respected. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to warmly welcome Miss Megan Briers. Megan, over to you.
Thank you. Amazing. I'm going to try and share my screen and we will see how it goes. Okay. So you should be able to see just like an open tab.
Okay. Is it possible to make it bigger?
Yes, yes. Okay. I'm trying to just move things around my screen and do that. Okay.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Let me just drag various parts. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we're seeing your notes.
Yes, yes. I'm aware. I'm just trying to. The bar is. Oh my goodness. Okay. I'm so sorry. This bar is just.
It's all right.
Okay. Can you now just see this, like the?
No, it's just showing like the top left corner.
Interesting. Okay, I'm gonna stop share and do that again and share something slightly different. Okay. Right. I just now present full screen. Okay. Now can you see just?
I think that's working now. Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
A little technical rough start, but that's
all right.
We'll go with that.
Over to you.
Perfect. So, hi, I'm Megan. As Jared has introduced, I'm currently doing my master's in the history of philosophy science at Cambridge, and today I'm going to be talking about the research that I did for my first essay there. Firstly, I want to start by thanking Jared for letting me present here and for all the hard work that he did to get this conference shifted to online, so we still have this opportunity to talk about history of astronomy. So yeah, in this presentation, I'm going to investigate how women were involved in eclipse expeditions in the 19th century with a specific focus on 1870. And I'm going to talk about considerations about why these women were on the expedition, how they were able to participate, and how it changes because we've got this unique astronomical event away from the typical observatory and the typical metropoles that this happens in. So, in the history of astronomy talk, I'm first going to deal with the astronomy and look briefly at the different types of eclipses. You're going to have to forgive me for not going into much technical detail. I did my undergrad in math, so this is all a bit on the applied side for me. But there are three types of solar eclipses, which all involve some form of blocking of the sun's light by the moon. We have a total solar eclipse, the one on the right. The moon here is appearing as large, at least as large as the sun. And this year we're going to have a total solar eclipse on the 20th of April, so they tend to happen a couple of times, at various kind of intervals. Then you also have the partial and the annual solar eclipses. They're both characterized by the fact that the sun is not completely covered by the moon. The characteristics of eclipses that are particularly interesting, they're quite rarish events. They're geographically restricted, so you're going to have to often travel to view the eclipse. And the time that you have to make your observation is often very short, typically only a couple of minutes. There are other factors that can get in the way of your observation, like clouds, which happens a lot in the 19th century. From this point on in the presentation, if I say eclipse, I am talking about a total solar eclipse. just because that was the main kind of thing that they dealt with in the 19th century. So again, why I'm focusing on the 19th century is because the mathematical tools that they used to predict where the eclipses were going to be got more precise at the kind of start of the 19th century, which meant that they could predict far enough in advance where eclipses were going to be in order to kind of mount these giant expeditions, which they increasingly did over the century to kind of go and take scientific observations. So hopefully I've given a rough enough explanation of what an eclipse is before I jump into their expeditions. I'm going to just summarize what my presentation will cover today. I'm going to first take a look at Victorian solar eclipses in general, expeditions in general, to kind of offer a context of why they went on them, what they kind of involved, and then justify why 1870 is especially interesting for reasons including the number of women and also the kind of infrastructure that is built around it. Secondly, I broadly split the presentation by the kind of work that women were doing in the 1870 eclipse, which was verification and then also independent observation. So I'm going to discuss the work of the women in both these groups and look at what they can say about women's participation in astronomy more generally. And then finally, I'm going to conclude by offering some preliminary thoughts on how women's position in astronomy changed over this period and why, in paying attention to what the women were doing, we can learn more about astronomical fieldwork in general and women's participation in science. So, Victorian solar eclipse expeditions. I'm going to give a brief rundown on some context on those. Eclipse observations and even expeditions were happening long before the 19th century, but the 19th century kind of witnesses this first systematic run of expeditions sent out by multiple types of countries to extract information about the solar eclipses. So I'm going to focus on the British and American eclipse expedition. The British sent out their first expedition in 1842 and the Americans in 1851. This is a pragmatic choice, mainly due to my restricted language skills in what documents I can read, but these countries also worked together across the century with the expedition. So it's an interesting comparative here. So why eclipse observations? Why did year after year astronomers treat out to multiple locations to kind of spend a few minutes hoping that they wouldn't be clouded out? There's kind of three broad sweeping motivations for why they traveled to view the eclipses in the 19th century. And it's worth noting that these different motivations had different levels of importance for the astronomers over the different years. So it wasn't the case that this mattered to them for the same reasons across the whole century. So firstly, it was an opportunity to examine the corona, which is this kind of white layer around the sun, the moon, and the prominences around the corona. And people like William Huggins did try to replicate the effect that the eclipse had outside of fieldwork. And they did have various levels of success with this across the century, but importantly, they continued to go on the expedition right through into the 20th century. So secondly, as tools like the spectroscope were introduced, there were increasing opportunities to analyze the chemical composition of the outer atmosphere. And then thirdly, there was also an opportunity to search for intermercurial planets. They thought there was a planet, at least one, that was missing at the time that a lot of these expeditions were going out. And you got a unique view of the object position around the sun at the time of an eclipse. So those were the kind of three reasons that they were mainly going frequently to these eclipse expeditions. So in the early years of the British expeditions, they were often put off by a group of well-off astronomers traveling in small groups and reporting their findings back, as Alan Chapman has extensively explored in his book on Victorian amateur astronomers. In the early 19th century, astronomy really was led and progressed by often wealthy gentlemen with money and time to spare to do the observational work. And we see a similar pattern in the kind of initial expeditions on the British side. At the risk of glossing over too much at once, there were some key technical and infrastructural changes that changed the nature of expeditions as the century progressed. So things like the introduction of the tools like the camera and the spectroscope changed the kind of nature of observations, but there was also development of infrastructure around the expeditions, like the institutional side, but also technological advances like the railways just made expedition work a lot easier as the century progresses. And all of these elements kind of factor into what Alex Sturgeon-Campan called the militarization of the expedition. So they gradually got increasingly controlled, increasingly regulated, and increasingly controlled by the government or formal academic bodies. However, there were alternative ways that emerged for both women and amateur astronomers to continue being involved in the eclipse expedition, specifically the founding of the British Astronomical Association in the 1890s. So the expeditions as an enterprise are relatively well studied. However, what I think we've failed to notice in our previous work on it is the sheer amount of involvement that women had in these expeditions. So this diagram is based on the research I've done so far. And while I definitely cannot say here and claim that it's a complete picture of the whole scene, it's a fairly representative sample of the number of expeditions and the number of women that I've found participating. So already there's some interesting patterns in this, including this drop-off in the 1880s and 90s, which definitely needs more research. But the purpose of this diagram is basically to highlight that women were very involved across the century, and to understand fieldwork as a phenomenon, we need to understand women's participation. So, turning to justify why my presentation focuses on 1870 specifically, pragmatically, as mentioned, 1870 is an expedition not just with a large amount of women who participated, but also has a large amount of archive material from the women who participated. So one thing to note when studying women in these expeditions is that finding archival material about them is a challenging task, and due to who was recorded as going and also just due to what has been stored. But 1870 boasts a couple of first-person accounts from the women that were present, as well as multiple mention from them in other resources. So that was a major motivating factor for the 1870 eclipse. In terms of specific astronomical questions that they were asking on this eclipse, they were interested in exploring what the corona was composed of and whether the things that they were witnessing were solar or terrestrial in their observations. So at this point of the century, the camera and the spectroscope are both introduced into the field and are being used. They're not stable technologies. They're kind of still figuring out how they're dealing with these technologies. But there was a real focus on the use of the spectroscope to establish kind of boundary lines of the corona and see what was going there with the composition. So I'm going to talk now about how the British and American parties prepared for the eclipse. So the 1870 eclipse marked the first partnership in Britain between the Royal Astronomical Society and the Royal Society to organise an expedition. And these societies continued to work together across the century, which eventually resulted in the formation of the Joint Permanent Eclipse Committee in 1894, which was a central body shared between the two to centrally organise eclipse expeditions. So that worked out, but 1870 did not. So by 1870, the British had been going on eclipse expeditions for a while, but this particular eclipse faced a lot of organisational road bumps, is what I'm going to call them. So George Airy, the Astronomer Royal at the time, put out an initial call for volunteers to attend the eclipse expedition in April. In August, he received the news that the government had denied the funding request that they wanted for the expedition. And while there is evidence of underlying interest in mounting an expedition between August and October, it isn't till late October, early November, where Airy learned that the government might be willing to reconsider the funding decision. So, ironically, the arrival of the American parties who were stopping in Britain before heading out to the observation stations helped, because on learning that their British counterparts didn't have any resources, they directly went and spoke to the British Prime Minister to kind of put some pressure on money, ships, resources to attend the eclipse. All of this was highlighted and covered by Lockyer in his nascent scientific journal Nature, who strongly took the opportunity to criticize the government and the overall organizational process. But luckily, in the middle of November, about 2 weeks before they needed to send out observers, they received confirmation that they were going to get some funding, and the kind of scrambling began to assemble parties in time for the competition. On the US side, things are so much less chaotic. The government granted support early to the expeditions. There were two main parties that I'm going to focus on, but there was also a couple more that went. But the two ones that I focus on is the US Coast Survey and the US Naval Observatory. So the Coast Survey side, the superintendent of the Coast Survey, and then the person that was mainly associated with the expedition was Benjamin Peirce, seen here. He sent his son, Charles Sanders Peirce, now better remembered for his role in the American pragmatism movement, on an advance party to scout out the best locations in Europe for them to view the eclipse. And this is monumental for the American parties, really, because it's the first time that they travel outside the continent to view the solar eclipse. So for many of the American observers, they also took this opportunity to visit the UK en route to the observing stations. As I met, it was a chance to socialise and meet with their British counterparts, as well as borrowing additional instruments for their observation. There was also the US Navy parties, Navy observatory parties, headed by Benjamin Sands. It was a much smaller observing set compared to the US Coast Survey with four main observers. And many of the US parties also travelled with their UK parties when they got over to Europe and shared some of the stations and locations. So, give a geographical sense of where the parties went in 1870. I threw together this map. I really like it when the maps have the line of totality, so you can see how it lines up. But hopefully, there should actually be a sense of where the eclipse is going to be viewable just by the shape of where the observers are placed. So they're all in Italy, and we've got a big cluster down here in Sicily. As I've mentioned, there were other countries that sent out expeditions. So we have the Italians at the top of the country as well, but they were mostly clustered in Sicily. And I don't believe there was actually any sharing of direct observational stations, but the British and American parties were based in the same towns and locations, and there was intermingling of the groups before and after the eclipse. So that's kind of the background context of eclipse expeditions. And from here, it's basically going to be a tale of two halves to talk about the work that the majority of women were doing. So we have the first side, which is going to talk about the verification of observations. We have people like Mary Newcomb and Winifred Lockyer involved in this work, and it's going to be a tale of what the kind of limitations are to women's position within the expedition. Secondly, I'm going to talk about Zena Peirce, who observed a new astronomical phenomenon and was taking independent observation herself. This is going to be a challenging place for Zena to be, and I'm going to talk about how her observations were received within the scientific community. And I would like to say that the roles that I'm talking about now are all within the context of the 1870 eclipse, and there are other work that women did in other expeditions, like logistical work and helping to plan the organizational side, but I've not found any evidence of this happening. Okay, so verification of observation was a major role that women played within these expeditions. So this typically involved women being pointed to in official reports to back up someone else's observation. So when an often male astronomer makes a new observation, he would write about this observation and then write a line after it being like, "My wife testified she also saw this phenomenon." So there's something here to be said about the nature of observation in an expedition that makes this a sensible part of the data recording. As I've mentioned, the time is very short to take your observation, and there is a sense that your observation is fleeting. Cameras were coming in, making it more reproducible, and they did take sketches of observation, but there is still a heavy reliance on the individual observer. Really, the observation was made by a human eye or a telescope, so you have this implicit dependence on the person taking the observation. And it's interesting to find that there are frequent calls to the women around the male observers to verify what they've seen, but no justification about why these women themselves would be a reliable source. Oh, sorry, skip forward too early. But there were two women on the 1870 eclipse expedition that were at some point involved in verification work. The first of which is Mary Newcomb, pictured here. So Mary Newcomb was not an official member of the eclipse expedition, and the only mention that she has in any kind of reports to say that she's there is when she is used to verify the observation. Mary Newcomb herself wrote a diary of the 1870 eclipse. It's over 100 pages. It's a really personal and very informal account of the eclipse, which gives this really interesting perspective that you don't get through official reports. My favorite quote from it has to be when she says, "Simon, or her husband, dined at the governor's, who did not invite me because he knew nothing of me." And I think this really speaks to the invisibility of these women on the expedition. Even at the time, they were very much overlooked by the people around them. So she doesn't write about her role in the observations in her own diary. She instead spends pages in her diary sketching the donkey used to carry her bag when they were in Sicily, but doesn't speak of the actual event itself. But it is worth mentioning that she was writing this account for her daughter, and it was never intended to be a public or a true record of the complete eclipse. So here's a quote from Simon Newcomb's official report of the eclipse for the US Observatory report. Just to briefly mention Simon Newcomb, at the time was on the rise in the American astronomical community. I read that one way to describe Simon Newcomb would be to say in an article once, is that if America had an astronomer royal, it would have been Simon Newcomb. So he really was a very powerful figure within the American astronomical community. So when verifying his observations of the sun and the positions of the planet, this quote shows him calling both Mary Newcomb and Mrs. Spragg to agree with what he's seen. And here we see this instance where Mary's voice is combined with others around to kind of lend authority to Simon Newcomb's initial observation. So this is one demonstrated example of the verification on the eclipse. And the second example of this is Winifred Lockyer. So Winifred Lockyer on the 1870 eclipse is actually down as Norman Lockyer, her husband's spectroscopic assistant. There's no further clarification, and she's not mentioned in any later reports about what this work would have involved for her. And I really wish I knew more about her, because one of the other women on the expedition makes a comment about the way that Winifred and Norman Lockyer worked together, saying Mrs. Lockyer, as Norman's own assistant, a lady is tranquil as her husband is excitable, but who pursues his science and has written several books upon it, so that together they seem to lead that double life devoted to one end. So there's clearly a high level of involvement in the Lockyer, or high level of cooperation and involvement for Winifred in Norman Lockyer's work. So Winifred Lockyer, again, I don't know much about her on the 1870 eclipse, but her role in verification actually comes from the discovery that Norman Lockyer is most remembered for, the co-discovery of helium the year before. And this quote is from his account in the Royal Society's publications. And as soon as Lockyer spotted the green light on the spectroscope, he goes to fetch Winifred immediately to verify or endorse, in his words, his observation. So what's really interesting in both these cases is that these women are clearly granted some level of authority to make and verify these observations, and they're trusted in the sense that their confirmation of the observation is worth something. Interesting to note also that none of the women ever fail to verify what their husbands made, but obviously they may not even make it into report at that stage. However, so in none of the reports that I've seen was it ever stated why these women would have been good people to verify the observation. So this is in the case of the expedition, but there are some further comments in astronomical work at the time of other sorts that can offer some insight into why the trust was put for these women. So the other type of fieldwork that was a big deal in the 19th century was the transit of Venus. There were two transit of Venus expeditions in the 19th century, in 1874 and 1882, so quite soon after this specific expedition. The transit of Venus was a much rarer event, as I'm sure you'll know. They really only did have these two opportunities in the 19th century to take this observation. So at the time, they were particularly concerned with measuring the distance of the Earth to the Sun. Unfortunately, there was some logistical problems with the way that they were measuring, but that was the motivation for the transit of Venus in the 19th century. And this quote here is from the diary of Charles Ord Brown, who was an observer with one of the British parties out in Egypt for the transit of Venus. And he was there with his wife, who was one of the very few women who went on the transit of Venus expedition. So this is what he had to say about Prince Said, who was the widow of the Ottoman viceroy of Egypt. And he says, it would be interesting to see what the unprejudiced impression of a Circassian lady of superior mind, but who has been kept inside walls all her life. So in this case, Charles Ord Brown views the observations of this woman as unbiased and somehow uninfluenced by any theoretical concerns. That people with a training in astronomy or some previous exposure to any kind of scientific work would have been carrying when they were making an observation. So it starts to raise questions about whether the women on the eclipse expedition would also be good verifiers because of similar concerns, because logically a verification carries some extra weight if you're going to make the observation uninfluenced by any kind of background expectation of what you should be observing. So if we now flip to some other kind of work that women are doing in astronomy around this period, a similar sentiment is expressed about the work of the computers at the Harvard College Observatory. So this was a team of female computers that began working to process astronomical data on plates in the 1870s, I believe it's 1877 that they began this work. So really not temporarily far removed from this eclipse either. So there's a wide range of women employed to do this kind of processing. If you're interested, David Sabell has a great popular account of the work. But for the purpose of the presentation, I'm just going to call attention to one of the descriptions given to a computer, Annie Cannon, at her funeral. And they say that was the strength of her scientific work. Her classification was dispassionate and unbiased. So again, in this other work, we're seeing similar themes of objectivity in relation to the visual processing work that women are doing at this time. So there are some key differences in the work done by the women at Harvard and in the transit of Venus compared to the observers on the eclipse. I don't want to suggest that I'm drawing exact parallels between these different works, but these cases have illustrated that there are some general ideas floating around the astronomical community relating objectivity to female visual work. And there's more work to be done on this, especially with the introduction of the camera, really changing the nature of observation. But I think my current thought of this, again, this is very, I'm focusing on one eclipse and I really would like to take in broader considerations of other eclipses. But for the 1870 eclipse, I believe there may be slightly more to this idea of objectivity. For a start, we know that Winifred Lockyer is noted as being involved in the scientific work done with Norman.
Yes, just about.
Then it's also illuminated to pay a little bit more attention to which women were involved in this verification role. So verification is obviously important, but so is the status of the woman or the person doing the verifying. And the women who were involved in the verification work are almost, well, actually completely exclusively the wives of mostly senior astronomers. There are other women on these eclipse expeditions. This one specifically sees a couple of women being accompanied by ladies' assistants, but these are never the women that were involved in the verification. So if it was just as simple as whether women could take objective observations, we might see these other women in different social positions verifying observations as well. But I think there's something to be said about the combination of potentially objective observation and the social status of the woman doing it. So that was the first part of the presentation, which covers the verification role that women played in the eclipses. One of the women on the eclipse expedition was able to take some independent observations of her own, but she had a challenging time convincing the astronomical community that her observation was valid, which is interesting compared to the fact that all these women were used to verify other observations. So the next section is just going to look at this episode and try to assess how Zena Peirce, who takes these observations, and the reception of the observation, what that can teach us about women's positions in expeditions. So obviously all introductions to historical actors should come with some biographical information, but for Zena's position especially, I think taking into account the background context of her life up to this point is very critical. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes introducing Zena, Zena to you. So Zena Peirce, or her full name is Melusina Fay, but she goes by Zena, was born in 1836. A key part of her life was the death of her mother. Her mother died when she was 39 in 1836, so Zena was only 19. And the cause of her death was the fact that she was severely overworked from housework. So this had a lasting effect on Zena and the rest of her life, really. In terms of education, she attended the schools her parents ran. And then after the death of her mother, she started attending a young ladies' school where she studied subjects outside the usual curriculum, as noted. She was a class orator, and many people commented that she had a great mind and was very intelligent. There isn't a clear idea of how she was involved in science, but there is a sense from a lot of the biographical information about her that she was involved in science and she was intelligent and interested in applications of science before her involvement in the eclipse. So the reason we have all this biographical information about Zena is actually because she's more remembered for her feminist philosophy. Her most famous work is this 1869 publication on the cooperative housekeeping scheme, which was a scheme that she proposed in order to minimize the amount of time that women were spent doing housework, inspired by the death of her mother. So 12 to 15, in this cooperative housekeeping scheme, 12 to 15 women would work together in one house, which was going to be at the center of a community of houses, and they would do all of the housekeeping tasks for the rest of the community. The families in the community would pay into this scheme, and it would allow it all to be centralized in kind of one location as opposed to being in each of the houses. So in 1870, she actually ran a scheme trial of this, but this was right before she went on the eclipse expedition, and so the scheme eventually collapsed with multiple accounts at the time, kind of stating that the reason that it didn't run as smoothly as it could have was because she went on the solar eclipse expedition instead. So finally, her relationship is also important in this. She marries Charles Sanders Peirce in 1860, and I still have not fixed the slide, but she divorced him in 1883. That is not death. And Charles Sanders Peirce, over this period, again, remembered for his pragmatism, but in this period was employed by the US Coast Survey, which his dad was running at the time, and he was a surveyor. And it's most likely through this relationship that Zena ends up being an official member of the US Coast Survey Party in the 1870 eclipse expedition. So Zena was an official observing member of the US Coast Survey Party. She's on the record. She gets a report in the US Coast Survey report after, and yeah. So there was obviously something here to be said for family connections. Apart from Zena, very little women feature in the US Coast Survey reports over the same period. I haven't yet found another woman in the 19th century that's able to write a long report in the way that Zena did. Zena was allocated the role of sketching the eclipse on the expedition, which is phased out as a task as the camera starts to be introduced, but it was still a respectful way to kind of take observations of the eclipse in this period. And Zena herself comments on this role, saying that she expected to be just put on general observation, but to her consternation was told that she must sketch the corona. So before she got to Sicily, she'd been given a sketch which she practiced really diligently on. And she states, until I could draw it several times in a minute. See, from this, and also from her public writing about the event, you get this real sense of a sense of expectation and a feeling that she needed to contribute something for the honour of position as an official observer in the expedition. So before the eclipse, Norman Lockyer had drawn up a list of observations, of list of instructions for the people observing the eclipse to pay attention to. Zena and Lockyer met before the eclipse, but he did not pass on the instructions. She later received them from her father-in-law, Benjamin Pierce. And some of these instructions were like to note the change of tints, the color of shade of the disk in the moon compared to sun. So it was a series of instructions of what to look out for in the eclipse. So these are the two sketches Zena made. She published, or it's the same sketch, it's just two different publications. She published this in the US Coast Survey report, and she also wrote about her observation in a magazine in New England called The Galaxy. Her observations are later also reprinted in the Royal Astronomical Society Memoirs of Eclipse work, but that doesn't come until a lot closer to the end of the decade. And the key feature to note about these observations are these three dark lines at the bottom of the corona, because these were not expected and were kind of the talk of the time when it came to this expedition. So, as I mentioned, this was a relatively new phenomenon. They hadn't really expected to see this, and this really did become the main talking point and main observation of this expedition. This is from Zena's report in the magazine, and even though she was aware that it was a new phenomenon, she has clearly drawn up this diagram to illustrate that other people saw the same thing that she'd done. Notably, Briers who was responsible for photography on the British side, had taken a photo that Zena believed had also demonstrated these three lines. And Zena herself actually states she wouldn't have believed her own observations until she saw this photo, although that she is very contradictory about how much confidence she has in her observations. So what makes this as an interesting episode in itself is not really what Zena observed, but how her observation was received within the astronomical community. So there are three kind of key things that I want to draw attention to here. Firstly, she wasn't initially asked by anyone around her what she'd observed immediately after the eclipse. So this firstly demonstrates a complete lack of expectation that her observation was really going to add anything to the body of astronomical knowledge from the eclipse expedition. Secondly, she did eventually plug up the courage to volunteer her observation because she knew it was new and unexpected. But she writes that her observations were dismissed by those around her and actually written off as figments of her imagination. So even when she tries to let people know who hadn't initially asked her, she then faces further challenges. And then finally, this lack of anyone asking her and this dismissal when she did tell her observations meant that in the reports that came out of the eclipse, there's a consistent mention that nobody at the observation point that Zena was at had seen these dark rifts, and she wasn't credited with having made a successful observation in the reports that come out of Britain following the expedition. So again, I want to zoom out of the specific case, try and place it in the broader context of some other female work in astronomy at the time. We see a similar limit almost being placed on contribution of female popular science authors at the time. Mary Agnes Clerk was a prominent historian of astronomy and one of the female authors popularizing astronomy through her publications. But we see this mirror of the sort of work that the sort of problems that Zena faces in observations in reviews of Clark's work, specifically The System of the Stars in 1890. When Clark moves or attempts to move beyond the established knowledge of the field and offers her own opinions on some of the astronomical knowledge that she's writing about, one reviewer stated that her book would have been more valuable if Clark had confined herself to simply giving a trustworthy account of contemporary astronomical researchers and of the views held by competent thinkers. So this kind of comment is also reflective of the limit that authors like Margaret Brier and at the time faced. They were only permitted to do retellings of work rather than their own kind of original ideas. And authors like these were expected to stay within this very limited sphere of passively conveying scientific knowledge as opposed to a creation of new knowledge. And this is also reflected in the reception of Zena's contributions. So what have we learned from this Zena's observational work? There was clearly a place for women within these expeditions, but it wasn't necessarily at the forefront of knowledge generation. So Zena's case demonstrated that there was both a lack of expectation for her to make the observation and add to the body of astronomical knowledge. And then there was also challenges faced when she did volunteer her observation about whether this should even be trusted. Which is interesting, really, in comparison to the first half, where the trust of the verifiers was never questioned. So on this eclipse, similar to the female authors at the time, these women seem to be viewed as solely supportive figures rather than anyone that was going to make observations of their own. They were clearly valued for their unbiased confirmation of observations made by men who were seen as knowledgeable and authoritative enough to make these reliable observations. So to look back to the diagram that I showed at the start, this is really only the beginning of the work that could and should be done into women's positions on the eclipse expedition, because there are so many other cases of women that need to be paid attention to and so many more questions to ask about their contribution. But I've hopefully offered a sense of how looking at the work that women do on the expeditions can tell us not just about their involvement, but also about the broader astronomical community at the time and the patterns of trust and authority in their work. And I look forward to exploring this, hopefully in the context of other expeditions. Would love to hear if anyone's got any insight on other involvement of women in astronomical fieldwork. And thank you for listening.
Oh, great. That was wonderful. Thank you, Megan. Very interesting point of view. My own personal interest, of course, is the involvement in William Lascelles' two daughters, I think in the 1870 exhibition. And it's intriguing to see that the number of women for that particular exhibition, which I know you concentrated on, went up. Interesting. I think there might be a question on, there's a comment from Horace Smith. Later in the 1870s, groups from the US Women's College began to observe eclipses, at least eclipses within the boundaries of the US. Did these college observers change the perception role of women as eclipse observers?
Yes, so I presume this is in regards to Mariah Mitchell and the that community there. I think that's a really interesting case because you don't see an equivalent of that in the UK, and they're allowed to observe the 1860 eclipse, 1869 eclipse. But when they try to get support to go out the country, they're denied the ability to go to the Transit of Venus expedition. So yeah, I think there's something to be said about, again, they were happy to let these women go within the country, but they didn't let them go out with the US Coast Survey or the Navy Survey. So yeah, I do think that is also a very important case, and that's a great group of women-led astronomers.
Okay, any more questions from our online audience at all? If you want to indicate, there's one from, just go into the chat a moment. I think Winifred Lockyer, in brackets, and not her husband, close brackets, was on the ship which was shipwrecked during the 1870 eclipse exhibition. It would be a wonderful follow-up to that story.
Worth.
Yeah, she was, and that's actually the only writing that we have from her that I've found from her of her involvement in the 1870 eclipse. It's in Norman Lockyer's autobiography. That's the only piece of writing that we have of what she did in the observation, talking about this shipwreck that happened just before the eclipse expedition. So that is definitely worthwhile. And I've not been to see the Norman Lockyer archive material yet, so I really hope there's something there that talks a bit more about her involvement.
Okay. Any more questions? Either wave frantically or an indication. David, over to you.
Yes, was there, that was a really interesting talk, Megan. Was there ever a case made in the 19th century that possibly women were better observers than men, perhaps due to quite a few women having tetrachromacy, 4 different types of visual cone, which doesn't occur in men and is thought to give some women, quite a significant number of them, greater acuity of colour vision. Was there ever a case made for women being better observers?
So yeah, I've not heard the visual cone reasoning, but I do think there is at some point a sense of you're going to make a better observation if you are you have that unbiased and lack of theoretical concern, so you're not projecting what you're expecting to see. So I do think, yeah, it's a very visual processing, and the kind of thoughts around observations are a very tricky thing to kind of get from records. But I think there is potentially some kind of thing to be said there about women being better observers. But yeah, I really do feel like very much at the start of my research for that, and have a lot more to take into account for that. But thank you for raising that kind of condition.
There's a question and a raised hand. Paul Fuller.
Oh, hello,
Paul.
everyone. Hi, Megan. Thank you for such an interesting talk. I was going to say 2 things. I mean, I've been researching all the British and Irish time signals in the 19th century, and I've not come across a single lady involved in any of them. And here we're talking about 90 signals with several dozen people deciding where and when signals should be established. So it doesn't surprise me that the ladies in this expedition were treated in such an appalling way. But what I was going to ask you was, the British Association, didn't they become involved in this expedition? And weren't there ladies involved in this too?
Yes, absolutely. British Astronomical Association were a great source of opportunity for women to go on eclipse expedition. It is, yes, in the 1890s, so a bit later, and the amateur scene as opposed to the government organised eclipse. But yes, they are on my list of things to kind of add to the story, because a lot of women were involved, and that was a great opportunity for women to be able to go out at a time where they were still facing challenges on the government expedition. So, yeah.
Could I ask?
John,
Could
yes.
I
Thank you.
mention something, Gerard?
Yes, John, how would you?
Yes, it might be of interest to Megan I'm a member of the Norman Lockyer Society, and I know somebody who is doing PhD at Exeter University, particularly with the Norman Lockyer archive. And I know that there are things there that you might be interested to do with Mrs. Lockyer. So if I saw an email address earlier, wondering if I could just email you and let you have some more details about that, because it could be something you could pick up on.
Absolutely. And I know that Norman, because Winifred Lockyer, Norman's first wife, dies not very long after the eclipse, but I know that his second husband was also involved in astronomy, so I would love to hear more.
Yes, I think you might find there's some quite interesting resources for you on that.
Any more questions from anybody? We've still got a bit of time. Kevin? Yes?
Yeah, I've just got one to add. It might be a useful resource. As coordinator of the Society's survey, I keep a spreadsheet of all the entries we've added to the survey, and I've now got a tab which allows you to separate women from men. So if you ever want a list of possible people you've not come across, and female women that is, I can provide it. I think I provided it for previous speakers. So at the moment, I did a quick check. We had about 36 entries that were distinct. That may be of any interest. I could send that if you wish.
That would be amazing.
Okay.
Caroline, sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, it was just for the British Astronomical Association and the British Association for the Advancement of Science, because that also had a lot of women in it. I don't know how much they were involved in this. the British.
Yeah, I
Then
will. I will
that's-
have to have a look.
Okay, right.
But yeah, thank you very much. This is yeah, been great. Because resources are hard to come across. So I really
And
appreciate it.
I have to, I'm sorry, I can't leave it alone. I'll have to mention that Liverpool Astronomical Society, particularly before she became involved, obviously in the BAA, Elizabeth Brown.
Yes.
She, I do know that she actually organised at least 2 exhibitions through her own organisational skills, and she headed them. So Paul Fuller has got under the message on chat. I should also say that I found no one from what we would describe as not, an ethnic minority either. Thank you for an excellent presentation. Any more questions, please? We've still got a bit of time left. Anyone wants a question to Megan? Okay, before we do move on, I'd just like to thank Megan, and I wish all success in your continuing studies, and looking forward to perhaps hearing a follow-up presentation in future. That would be excellent. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip.
For the time being, thanks, Megan. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right, we're going to move on.